Stephen Stayner was missing for 7 years when he chose saving another boy, Timothy White, from his same fate, over remaining anonymous to the world. Stephen would be hailed as a hero, but for the third time, as a 14-year-old, his life would change drastically again, and in ways Stephen would never be able to control. On March 3, 1980, only 2 days after being found, and with little other details, the Merced Sun-Star, Stephen's home paper, would write that Stephen would always be known as, quote, the boy who was kidnapped. Despite enduring kidnapping, believing his family had abandoned him, and living with sexual abuse, society's insistence on seeing him solely as a person who had been kidnapped would become a crushing obstacle on his wish to become nothing more than an everyday person. And later in life, he would question whether it may have been easier if he had just stayed with Parnell. Join us as we detail the following days after Stephen and Timothy were found, and highlight the choices the press, police, communities, and the rest of the world made that would make Stephen's choice to come forward an even bigger sacrifice than he's often given credit for. In this episode, The Life and Kidnapping of Stephen Stayner, The Press. Welcome to episode 6 in our series on Stephen Stayner. This information in this episode originally started as part of episode 5 and a little bit of a much smaller part, but all the details I learned when researching this case, the information that we're going to give you here in this episode, and the experiences of Stephen had the biggest impact on me, and it's important to understand their significance. I think this is the beginning of a regrettable crime committed basically by society. On March 3rd, 1980, just 2 days after Stephen is found, the Merced Sun-Star will print an editor's article about Stephen coming home and how happy the community of Merced is. In that article, the editor describes Stephen as a boy who, quote, will forever bear the designation as the boy who was kidnapped for 7 years. And what struck me about this is really how truly after this research, this really sums up the rest of Stephen's life and also represents one of the major obstacles to Stephen and ultimately others who've been victims of crimes to coming forward. Parnell made a terrible decision for Stephen and changed the course of his life and hurt him immeasurably. But the way he's treated in the press and by the public at large was also a kind of crime. We've talked about several times during the course of these episodes about the insidiousness of sexual abuse and fear of coming forward, and that will also rear its head. But something we haven't talked about is the way people who come forward are treated and defined by the crimes they've experienced. In an interview later in life, Stephen will say that he wondered if it wouldn't have been better if he had stayed with Parnell. And this, coupled with what our research says happens to him when he comes home, it just really makes me angry to think the people in society, us, we're helping abusers keep their victims quiet because of the choices we make and how we view victims. And a lot of this still happens today. The Today Show recently interviewed the amazingly talented gold medal winning gymnast Simone Biles, where she discusses becoming depressed because she was scared to come forward about the abuse she experienced by the Dr. Larry Nassar. But the thing that really scared her was not necessarily the abuse or talking about it, but that if she came forward, she would no longer be seen for her accomplishments, but just as someone who was abused. So what happens to Stephen on these first couple of days is something that is still going on, that abuse victims are still feeling. And hopefully that's something we can still change. We are also in this episode going to share the experiences of Stephen's family and the White family because it's all connected. So we'll actually start with in Merced with Stephen's family. This episode will focus on the treatment by the press, but that will also wind its way through the last of our episodes because it becomes a huge part of Stephen's life moving forward. And with me to share the details in this episode are Sean and Charles. How are you guys tonight?
I'm excellent.
I'm doing great. I'm kind of anxious for this episode because of how much I don't like psychics. I don't like news reporters just as much. So I'm feeling like this episode's going to make me pretty angry.
I'm also excited for this episode. I think slightly different reason. I think this is a huge part of the story that often gets left off or we don't ever really talk about. You know, happy ending, he gets returned to his home. Everybody lives happily ever after. And I think the story that you're going to lay out for us is not that at all.
So in our last episode, we detailed the journey Stephen and Timothy made into Ukiah. This episode will, like as we said, we'll be covering the aftermath, specifically the first 2 days after they're found. And the information for this episode came from so many places because once they're found, everyone comes from everywhere to write about this story. But a big part of what we focused on came from the Merced Sun-Star and the Ukiah Daily Journal, and you can find those on our page for this episode. So we're going to go back to the first few hours after Stephen came forward, and one of the first things that happens as police are trying to get information together on what happened to Stephen during the 7 years he was missing is that word gets out that Stephen has been found. I actually don't know how the wider world finds out, but word spreads very quickly in a couple places, both in Merced and Ukiah. I do know, for instance, that one of the police officers, Russell Van Voorhees, if you remember him from last episode, he is the one who finds Stephen and Timothy on the street. He goes to find a friend of his who works at the Ukiah Daily Journal early in the morning of March 2nd, so just really quickly after they're found. He's very excited and asks his friend who works at the paper, who happens to actually be at the Palace Hotel, sounds like having a meal, if she wants to take a photo of Timothy and his mother. And she comes and does that. This is a photo that you'll see a lot in papers. It's from the moment when the two of them are sort of sitting together after he's just found. So really quickly.
What is the point of him doing that?
I think they're very excited. I don't think the Ukiah paper is the paper that tells the wider world what's going on. So I don't think they think that there's any harm in it. But I think the police are just really happy. These are people who we know when Timothy goes missing, they work overtime. They're not sleeping. They're doing everything they can to find this child. And at some point, they start to expect to just find his body. Okay. And so for them, they're not family, so it's a little bit different, but they've still put a lot of their own, both physical work and emotional, into finding him. And so when they find him alive, they're very happy and excited. I think just like...
On top of which, that it's, along with Timothy White, Stephen Stayner is there as well. So do you think that might have something to do with it too? That it's not only one, but it's both of them?
I don't have the exact time for when this happens, but it is in the nighttime, and it's still very early, and there doesn't say that she took pictures of Stephen, so I don't know. And on top of the police being really, I mean, they've given a lot to this, so has the paper. The paper ran a picture of Timothy every day that he was missing. They were really helpful trying to find him. So, I mean, this whole town, it's a smaller town. They're really emotionally invested in this as well. At 3 a.m. this same night in Merced, the Stayner family gets a knock on their door. When they answer it, the police are outside, and they tell them they found Stephen. According to the Stayner family, they ask him, quote, "Is he alive?" The policeman replies, "He sure is." And according to Delbert Stayner, both he and Kay began crying and hugging the officer. He'll note in the Los Angeles Times that, quote, "I think the police officer thought we were going to hug him to death." The Stayner family also began praying together. At the home that night were Kay and Delbert, as well as 3 of Stephen's siblings. They, like Stephen, had aged during the time he was missing. His sisters at the house were Cindy, now 16, Jody, now 13, and Corey, now 11 years old. Stephen's older brother, now 19 years old, Carrie Stayner, was in Yosemite on March 1st and 2nd in 1980, and not at home when the family were visited by police. Delbert and Kay also start calling friends and family. They're thrilled to get such good news after 7 long years, and they understandably want to share that with the people they know and with the town. But there aren't any victims groups to help them process this information, or guide them with what will happen next, or even to explain how Stephen might be feeling. And police don't really, if they do talk to them about this, they either don't listen to them, or police in Merced don't quite know how to handle this either. And this is all understandable. I mean, kidnapping like this is really rare. And if there's one thing we've seen this year in all our episodes, it's that the things we take for granted don't change or get better until something awful happens to change them.
It's not like a lot of the victims groups that we now have in place usually start after, as you said, something terrible happens.
Right.
Well, it seems like anything, you can't fix it until it's already broken. And it just seems that's the rule of everything.
It's a terrible irony on all of these stories.
The other way the press might have found out is through someone seeing, for instance, Kenneth Parnell get arrested. All I know is if they found out from Merced or Ukiah that the press does find out. And it's sort of a domino effect, and will be a much different reaction than when Stephen goes missing. And this kidnapping is considered one of the most publicized in history. But if you remember back at the beginning in episode 2, when we talked about people trying to get the word out and the family telling people it's not as covered then as it is later. Here is where it really gets kind of crazy with the amount of coverage. And 1980 is a big year for journalism and its growing worldwide domination. In June of 1980, CNN will go on the air for the first time, so media is just beginning a new phase. And while it's not on the air to cover this in March, the trials take a couple of years, so it'll be on the air during all of those. The other thing that happened was that reporters had also gotten to know the Merced area and the Central Valley because of some famous crimes that happened during the time Stephen was missing, including the Chowchilla bus kidnapping, which happened in 1976. The Merced Sun-Star will note that when that happened, reporters flocked to the Central Valley. Merced is only 18 miles from Chowchilla and is the closest big city. The bigger city is actually Madera, but that's 40 miles away south. So when reporters came to this area to cover that crime, they get to know reporters in the area. So it makes it a lot easier just to kind of pick up a phone, ask some questions, find out what's going on, or even to come here because you already know what's going on. The editor of the Ukiah Daily Journal, Jim Garner, writes that there are many more reporters in Ukiah than in 1978 when all of the Jim Jones events happened. And as we go through these first couple of days, it's also important to remember that this is not a social media world. And as we said, the 24-hour news cycle hasn't quite started yet, and neither has really talk radio. In 1976, and according to Gallup, 72% of people had confidence in the media. So as we go over these next 2 days, we're going to see the media talk to a lot of people, and people share really private things. And I just think it's important to know that this is a different time period. I think people are trusting of the press. They think that they're almost telling a friend something, and they don't quite know how that will affect the families in this situation.
It's almost like what we had with social media, when the evolution of social media. I think it took a while for people to realize the power it had, so they were more willing to post things publicly without understanding that it's public.
Right, and I think that's true of the press here. When we went over both Timothy White going missing and Stephen Stayner going missing, we saw a need for families and for the police to help the press and the press to help them, because you need to get the word out. You have to tell people. And the Stayner family in particular, for those 7 years, doing anniversary stories, you really need people to be invested in this story so that someone might find something or see something and they can tell you. But now, when they're coming home, to have so much press asking you questions or kind of in your face, it's sort of a whole different thing.
It's almost the exact opposite, where before it's the police and the parents, I don't want to say egging, but egging the media on to please cover this story, please get it out public, please cover the story. And now those roles are reversed, and it's the media feeding off of those parents. Entertainment is not the best word, but it feels more like that. Like, we want more of the story, and we'll do whatever it takes to get it.
Right. I think entertainment does come into this, but I also think there's something about doing those articles at front at the beginning when someone goes missing that people get emotionally invested. People who listen to them or read them, as well as the journalists. So it's hard to sort of shut that off.
So you said at this time 76% of people trusted the news. Do you have a stat now? Yeah,
last year Gallup said that according to their research, 45% of people trust mass media.
So it's way lower.
Yeah, it's a little bit different.
Which is interesting because of the amount of media that people consume now.
That might be the problem, though.
Because it's too much.
It's too much, and everyone has their own skew on the one story. So They don't know how to trust it, because a lot of times with social media, it's more of the
echo chamber effect.
That also, but I was thinking more like clickbait, where every headline will have this horrible, weird story, and it's really nothing to do with the actual information.
And it's just important to know that the media finds out about this, Stephen and Timothy being found, in the very first hours of them coming home. And so they're coming and interviewing people and finding out things, but in the midst of police investigating. And the police have a lot to go through. I mean, they have the 16 days that Timothy has been missing, but also 7 years. Parnell's been moving around a lot. So that's a lot to get through in the midst of the press finding out what's going on. And even the police don't have a good grasp yet on what Stephen's life has been like. When he talks with them, he does not tell them about the abuse he suffered, and he is directly asked that question. So police do kind of wonder, but he tells them that didn't happen. The press will start printing information they find about Parnell's first crime in Bakersfield and the stint in prison on about March 3rd. So that's when they sort of get more information after that and start thinking things might be a little different than they look on this first day.
So they're digging up information about his previous conviction for child abduction and sexual assault on a minor.
Right, they find that, and as do the police, and that kind of changes how they look at this situation. So back in Merced, as we said, the Stayner family have been visited by police, and they're calling their friends and family, just elated at the news. They haven't been given much information on Stephen. The information for many days, it flows pretty openly. I think the police talk to them, but the police don't have that much information. But they do know that Stephen, for instance, is being hailed as a hero and what he's done for Timothy. Stephen himself has only given the police minimal information, and police only charged Parnell with molestation charges on March 25th, 1980. So these early days, this idea that Stephen has suffered sexual abuse, it's just not something the family knows about or is told about. And the police, they don't have any information or any specifics on that yet. At any rate, in Merced on March 2nd, 1980, by 9:30 a.m., just a few short hours after Stephen walks into the Ukiah police station, the Associated Press, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, the LA Times, and CBS TV have full reporting teams, cameras, all on the front lawn of the Stayner home. Stephen is still in Ukiah. He hasn't come home yet, and he hasn't even talked to his family on the phone. But the press is at the Stayner home, moving in and out of the house and asking the family questions. Basically doing interviews with the family, extended family, neighbors, friends, people driving by, just anyone who will talk to them. And they aren't unwelcomed by the Stayners, who are experiencing just a ton of happiness. I mean, it's hard to describe how low the Stayners have been. Having to spend 7 years, not even just missing their child, but coming in and looking at pictures of other kids and getting a lot of false starts only to find out it's not their son. And now he's coming home alive.
We've talked a lot about, too, the idea that there's really no basis of reference. I mean, nothing we can talk about. I'm not comfortable. I could not put myself in their position because of that. Like, no one would know how low those people.
Yeah, you don't know how low, how high, what they're thinking. There's no way to know any of this. We just know it from the papers and how it's being described and everything, because you really can't figure out how to feel.
Well, and two, because we've talked a little bit about this, the idea that some of these news agencies have been with the family for a long time. Local newspapers, but even maybe some of the state newspapers that have gotten to know the family over the 7 years. So even what they're feeling, they're reporting on this and being elated about the fact that it's a happy ending to this story.
The Stayners are told that the Merced police will be bringing Stephen home that Sunday, and throughout the day, more and more people are beginning to come over to the Stayner household. And I think this is because the town, like the editor of the paper said, this is their victory too. I mean, the town was looking for Stephen. They chipped in. They were scared themselves. They drove their kids to school. So this is just good news all around. And it isn't as if there's separation between the press, as we said, and all the people at the Stayner home. As I said, they're not even just on the lawn. They're all mixed together throughout the house. But at some point during the day, about 350 plus people are at the Stayner home waiting for Stephen to get there. The family is serving coffee and people are bringing food, and it sounds more like a celebration. And the Stayners have a big family as well. For instance, Stephen is one of 17 grandchildren that his grandfather, Jess Stayner, already had in 1980. The Stayner family is also a member of a church with a large community in town, so there are just a lot of different kinds of people there. Friends, family, close friends, neighbors. At one point, there's so many people, they're filling up neighbor houses as well.
So, and you'd want to celebrate. I mean, the Stayners have in part been sustained by this extended network of friends and family and community members that have helped them cope and really survive this. So I can understand the idea of wanting to share this time with them.
Oh, absolutely. The phone at the Stayner house is also ringing just off the hook, as well as at the newspaper and the police station, from people who just want to call in and find out if the news is actually true. The Stayners also pull out all of Stephen's Christmas presents from the year Stephen went missing, as well as presents they bought for his birthday and other holidays during the 7 years that he was gone. They lay them on the kitchen table for Stephen to open up when he finally gets home. And this is just a weird fact, but one of the presents was a big gym doll, which I had never actually heard of. Had you guys ever?
Yeah, actually, I had heard of the big gym doll. It was like, it's a like the next evolution of like the old G.I. Joe from the 50s and 60s. So it's like the boy version of Barbie. You dress him up and he comes with like action packs and
Yeah, he looked like a cross between a Ken doll and a David Hasselhoff doll.
Yeah.
Because he's not wearing a shirt, he's got little red shorts on. And I guess you push him and he does a karate chop motion. just seemed like a weird doll. So
It's almost like the old Mego toys. If you're a toy nerd, then you know what a Mego is.
So it's not important. I just thought I'd mention it. Kay Stayner also tells the newspapers that, quote, if I could find a Christmas tree, I'd put it right up, but it'd probably be hard to find someone with one now. And I think the family is just, they're really excited to be giving, obviously, his presents now, but they also want him to know that he was thought about all the 7 years that he was gone.
I think also, I mean, with this celebration, everyone's going, it's like a holiday in town. It's like the Super Bowl all of a sudden. It's really a big celebration. So I can understand where she's coming from, the joy of Christmas, and she just wants to make everything happy.
Yeah, they probably deserve that after all those years.
Mm-hmm.
This excitement also spreads throughout town. A neighbor was in the middle of baking a birthday cake on Sunday morning when she heard the news that Stephen was coming home, and she turns the birthday cake into a cake for Stephen. She brought the cake over to the Stayner house. It was white cake with blue frosted letters that said, "Welcome home, Stevie." People also bring over 2 hand-painted banners that are hung on the house. They both say, I think, "Welcome home, Steve." And as I said, they're welcoming to everyone. And some of the people, the press interviews, they don't even seem to know the family. They're just there. They want to celebrate, but they also want to catch a glimpse of Stephen because they know he's coming home. And the Stayner family's doing things like giving tours of the house and of Stephen's old room, which is now solely Carrie's room. Delbert tells reporters that the two will not have to share a room again, and Stephen does actually move into that room when he comes home. And one of the people celebrating also bring over a keg. So again, this is very much just a celebration, and people are excited at the chance to see Stephen. And the general consensus among these people who are at the Stayner house is that this is all a quote-unquote miracle. The Stayner family also immediately begin getting offers from people who want to buy their story. One executive calls to tell them that Stephen's story is, quote, one of the greatest of the century. The family has to hire a lawyer on this first day because they're fielding as many as 12 to 15 offers. And when asked by the press if they want to sell the story to someone to tell in a movie or even a book form, Delbert Stayner replies that they probably do. And I think they will actually change their minds, not change their minds so much, but this will change over the next year or so when they think about it and when they see all of the press and what kind of happens to them. And we'll talk about that probably in our last episode when we get to it. But on this first day, I think it's hard to ask them these questions about their future. They've never been through this. They haven't even seen Stephen yet. They haven't talked to him. They're still processing. They don't know that much about what he's been through.
It seems like these questions from the reporters, they're just like wolves for blood. For one thing, they're asking the family before Stephen's even there. They're asking if the family was selling their story, but they're asking, are you going to sell Stephen's story? And he hasn't even been there to make a decision. So it's just, I mean, with the offers, the book offers or movie offers, and these reporters just asking insane questions of not anything that they know about yet, it's kind of crazy.
And I wonder if it is part of the fact that they don't know really what to ask. Like, what do you ask a parent whose child has been missing for 7 years, and most of America probably wrote off as being dead?
You just back off until you get the story.
Right. You hope they would. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you would hope now, I really think you would be protected from the press. There would be someone in the police or with one of these victims groups who's just keeping you from them altogether. I would hope. But I think partially the press is there when these calls are coming in. So they're hearing that Hollywood is calling. So the question probably just comes to their mind to ask. But it is just, to me, it's a really unfair question. And we've been researching this for so long that I've seen a lot of stuff that's really judgmental of this family. And there's no way anybody's prepared for this or knows how to handle it.
No, they've gone through absolute terror and heartbreak for 7 years. And now to go from the lowest, probably one of the lowest points a parent could be in, to now the exact opposite of that. I can see, I can't, but I'm going to try to imagine if I was Delbert and somebody came and said, do you want to sell your story? I would think, and for me, it would be, this feeling of joy that my son is coming home. Look at my community around me. Of course, like, this is an amazing story. It's a miracle. I want everybody to know this, without thinking about the realities that it, like you said, Sean, it's not my story. It's my son's story. It's our story. And what my son went through is not maybe something he wants to share.
And actually, Kay Stayner, on this first day, she has a quote that she gives to reporters that and this isn't in reference to that, but she says it, quote, she wanted to share her joy with the world, the whole world. Maybe this will give some hope to others with missing children. So, I mean, this is a family who knows that there are other people out there who are not going to get this happy answer, or who, I mean, are still waiting to find out. And maybe sharing their story will help them keep going.
Almost living vicariously through. If it happened for that family, I can still, 7 years later, maybe I can hold out hope a little bit longer.
Right. At 12 p.m., the Merced Police Chief Harold Colberth and Lieutenant Bill Bailey go to the Stayners' home to talk with them privately. He tells them that they have, quote, a nice, bright young man who is very mature. They also update them on when Stephen will be getting home that day, and on the case sort of in general, but it's still very early, and I'll keep mentioning how little anyone really knows about what Stephen's been through. That includes police, because he's only just been found, and the press are asking questions like the Stayners should sort of have everything all figured out, when they've never been through this before and they don't have all the information. The point of this episode isn't to judge anyone, including the family, but to shed light on the experiences of victims. And the Stayners are victims in this story as well, as are the Whites. So this is really about how we can kind of change this so it doesn't happen now. The Stayners will also tell several reporters that they're angry Stephen was taken, but happy someone took care of him during the years. Police tell them that Stephen was enrolled in school, for instance, so for them this is a good thing. They, again, don't have all the information. And this isn't a sentiment that is something just the Stayners feel. When Angie White is asked early on, she says something quite similar, that she feels grateful Timothy was at least taken care of. And again, I can't stress this enough. Two things seem to be happening here. The first is an understanding on behalf of police of Parnell's history. They don't know that much about this guy. They're still finding information on who he is. And at first, it will not be uncommon for police to tell the press that they think his motive for kidnapping both Timothy and Stephen were to build a family. So police are still figuring this whole thing out as well. In Ukiah, Mendocino County District Attorney Joe Allen will tell the press, quote, I've never seen anything like this happen before. It's particularly hard to consider a child actually being raised by a kidnapper. That's the fascination aspect to the whole thing. And that's a direct quote from Joe Allen. So the parents of both boys and the police, they're still trying to figure out what's really going on in this case. To them, this is someone who's just kidnapped two people, perhaps to build a family. The second thing is that on this Sunday, just a few short hours after these kids have been found, both families are answering questions, not just from police, but from the press. And as I said, they're still processing, so answering these questions about their thoughts and feelings, that's just a lot to ask of anyone going through this. And I think they're doing this partially because they're so happy. I mean, the worst case scenario for them was that their child was murdered. And so now someone's coming home. No matter what happened, this is good news. Kay has this to say about the kidnapping. Quote, I don't like what he did. It was a very, very cruel thing to do. But now that we have Stevie, I thank the good Lord that he had the sense to raise him well and treat him right. I mean, God, so many kids are killed and Stephen was saved. And I think on this first day, like we said, they're processing, but also there's expectations, I think, for how you would feel. You don't want to seem ungrateful. They know there are people out there who are still waiting to find out what happened to their kids.
I think in hindsight, the best thing that anyone could have done was just not talk to anyone until they figured out more. Because like with this, whatever she says, all these quotes that are coming out, people are going to judge. They're going to make their own decisions on a story they hardly know. It's kind of like when you're arrested, you're not supposed to talk to cops at all because they can use whatever you say or twist it however they want. Not twist. I'm not like saying that it's bad. I'm just saying your words can mean so many different things.
Unintentionally. Somebody
Right.
on the outside without any context, or it would then, again, I mean, that's in the Miranda rights. Your words can be used against you in a court of law. And in this case, Kay's words will be used against her in the court of public opinion. And they're out there forever. And then now they're in newsprint and, in 2019 on the internet.
And to follow that point, I did research when I put together this episode on what kidnapped victims should do when they come home, or families. And I couldn't find out all much that was specific. But what I did find over and over and over again was that kidnapped victims felt like they were most helped when they were kept away from the media. And I think families too, to process and heal. And partially because in this case, you can really see it. Stephen Stayner, they do so many interviews up front, and he will later say that he rarely denied an interview because he always hoped there was someone out there who was kidnapped or went through what he did, who might hear him and come forward. But for a lot of victims I saw, for them, not doing interviews meant that the press interest kind of died down pretty quickly over time. The police will also tell the family that Stephen is bringing a dog home to Merced with him. We'll talk more about this when we go through the day as Stephen experiences it, but when the police leave the house, the Stayners announce to this crowd that are at their house that he's bringing a dog home, and people, they get really excited and they're cheering. So there's just tons of glee in Merced that that Stephen's coming home. The police also give insight into what Stephen went through or is like, and this seems to hit Delbert hard in particular. In the Merced Sun-Star, an upset Delbert says, quote, "It's going to take a lot of adjustment when Stevie comes home. They say he called that man who took him daddy."
That must be painful to hear, that after 7 years, your son, who you're ecstatic to have home, is calling somebody else daddy.
Well, and it's a big break from what they've been experienced, which is just excitement.
Mm-hmm.
And now this must really hurt.
I think this is almost like the first inkling of the darker side of what Stephen coming home really means for the family.
Right.
I mean, this is just one instance, and I think when the rest of the story of Stephen's life these past 7 years comes out, the entire family will have a hard time processing both their joy with the pain of his abuse and captivity, and this calling somebody else dad is kind of the first inkling of that.
In the midst of all these people celebrating, Stephen Stayner's brother, Kerry, drives up to the house at 4:20 p.m. I also want to say, on top of all the people who are at the house, people are also driving by and honking their horns, and the Stayner family had been told that Stephen would be home in the early afternoon. So with each car that goes by, people sort of rush to see who's in it because they're expecting that it might be Stephen. So everyone's just really excited. Kerry had been in Yosemite, and as Kerry doesn't have a cell phone in 1980, he learns that his brother has been found on the radio as he's on his way home. As he got closer to Merced, a local station was talking about Stephen being found, and he will say that he almost drove off the road when he heard the news because he was so excited. And here's the thing, we will be talking about Kerry Stayner in another episode, but this reminded me recently we were watching 2020, and in that episode they talk about Kerry Stayner's attitude that first day when Stephen comes home, and they show pictures about how unhappy he is. But when I read this in the newspaper, what I found out was when Kerry drives up to the house, the first thing he sees are people rushing towards his car because they think it could be Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing he sees is all these people, and they're all through his house. They're talking to his family. There are press everywhere. And for him in the paper, it seems like he has a bit of a different reaction than the rest of his family. They're obviously very excited and they're welcoming, and that's not a wrong thing to feel. But he's a little more concerned that there are a lot of people, to me it seemed, in this sort of thing that should be more private. They're going to see Stephen for the first time. There's just press all over.
I would absolutely hate that. I mean, if there's more than 2 cars in front of my house when I come home, I freak out. I don't want to talk to anyone. And then seeing all this, and yeah, when you haven't seen someone for 7 years who's your actual brother, and you have all these people you don't know, it would be a horrible feeling for myself.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would have that response, especially here's a guy who spent the last few days in Yosemite, away from people, camping, dealing with all of the last 7 years, and then finding out over the radio, not even like his parents who had somebody come to the door, and then to show up and 350 people, some probably you knew, some you didn't know, it's almost like opening up that wound that when they were all there beginning 7 years ago with the initial kidnapping.
And he is probably just I just imagine getting details for the first time from his family too. The details they've gotten from police about what's going to happen and maybe a little bit what Stephen's been through. But you're getting that sort of like bad news or in front of all of these other people. I just can't imagine that.
Well, it's another instance where we've talked a lot about in these episodes, but then even going back to a lot of our other episodes where this one snapshot in time, because the picture you're referring to is the one that's really famous with you see him kind of standing behind his parents and Stephen, and he does kind of look a little scowly in the picture, but it's people standing on the outside of that judging somebody, regardless of what he will do in the future, but this is people judging how somebody's reacting or what they're feeling from a photograph.
Yeah, and I can't tell you exactly what he's thinking. All I know is when he actually talks to the Merced paper, what he says. And he says, when asked about the media, he says it's getting a little ridiculous. And it just, from his quotes, it sort of sounds to me that he's just upset there are a lot of people intruding on this moment. And I think knowing now, especially, I would hope kidnap victims are brought home in less public ways, that's not a crazy thing to be thinking. I mean, I don't think anybody is feeling anything they shouldn't. If you're happy and excited, that makes sense. But if someone else is a little bit more wary and wondering what's gone on with his brother the last few years and not really sure everyone should be here, I think that makes sense too.
And probably he's somewhat protective of his parents as well. You know, I mean, he is the older brother, and I can see that, seeing your family and seeing on an intimate level what they've had to go through these 7 years, and the highs and the lows and the possibilities. And, you know, for myself, I don't want to say I'm a pessimist by nature, but great, they found him. But until my brother's with us at our home, I'm going to reserve some skepticism.
Carrie also tells the press he's excited to see his brother again, and when asked about Parnell, says, quote, "I'd rather not express that. That man has given away 7 years of my brother's life for nothing. It could have been better spent. I'm just thankful he didn't hurt him at all." At 6:30 p.m., the Stayners get a phone call from the police, and they tell them that Stephen has just left Manteca, California, on their way to Merced. Manteca is about 55 miles from Merced, so about an hour away, sort of conservatively.
Hi, this is Edward October for OctoberPodVHS.com, here to tell you what people are saying about our true crime podcast. A thread store in Arizona says, too much dribble and slang. These ladies obviously enjoy their own humor and sound high. Hey, at least they called you ladies. Benny from Idaho says, your topics are so appealing, but a 3-person pod is difficult enough to follow without banter? Our true crime podcast only has 2 people? Wait. Where's the other 100 5-star reviews? Can somebody give me the 5-star reviews? Okay, here we go. Much better. Luscious Lee says, stand up. 5 stars. You girls are funny AF. I especially love the me and Mrs. Jones rendition you sneak into the recording. Cherry G107 says, I struggle finding a new podcast, and so far, I've been hooked to you guys' podcast. Keep up the good work. Thumbs up, smiley face. Our true crime podcast, 2 girls, 1 story, and lots of bad renditions of songs you love. Available on your favorite podcatcher. Go binge it today.
So now we're going to go through the same day, but tell you what Stephen and Timothy experience, because everyone's lives are about to interconnect, and we don't want to confuse anyone with who we're talking about. In Ukiah, the Sunday after Stephen and Timothy are found, the day would be very different. Timothy is released to his family after being questioned by the police. Remember, while Stephen is taking care of Timothy, he wasn't actually there when he was kidnapped, so he doesn't have that part of the story. Timothy tells the Ukiah police that a second man was there when he was taken by Parnell. Timothy doesn't remember much about the man except that he had on sneakers and a baseball cap. And I think that Timothy is young and he gets grabbed off the street. I'm not sure he actually ever gets a really good look at Sean Portman's face.
That's still pretty impressive. I mean, given everything that kid has went through, to even have those 2 details, he had sneakers, he had a baseball cap. You know, and you hear that oftentimes that investigators say any little piece of evidence or recall can help.
Right. But unfortunately, because of that, police don't seem to put too much stock in the idea that there's another man who helped Parnell kidnap Timothy. In the last 2 episodes, we talked about Timothy being irritated a couple of times, specifically when people didn't believe him. The first was when Stephen didn't think he actually knew how to get to his house. This will be the second time because Timothy is very adamant that there was a second person there when he was kidnapped. He talks about it being a struggle. He talks about it screaming. And the police just don't seem that area where it happened, that could have happened and people have not seen it.
Did the police ever consider that it might have been Stephen?
I don't think so, because if you remember when Sean Portman helps Parnell, he drops him off before they get to the cabin. So even though Timothy is under a blanket, when he gets to the cabin, it's just him and Parnell. And later, he and Parnell go and pick Stephen up at the bus stop. So there's A, he's been at school all day, so he has an alibi. And B, I think bringing him in, it just doesn't make sense to them that it would be Stephen. And in the Santa Rosa Press Democrat, the police are asked directly if they think that there's a second person or they believe that there's a second person. And they say no, but they won't answer the question of whether or not they have another suspect in mind. And even Timothy's parents feel like it might be unlikely that there was another person there when he kidnapped, or it happened the way that Timothy remembers it happening. And while they believe him, they actually have him reenact what happened with his father playing the part of the kidnapper. Angie White will say doing this scared Timothy, and he had some trouble looking at his father the same way for a bit. He was traumatized by reenacting the kidnapping. So I think the adventure thing, which is mentioned a lot, might just be Timothy's way of coping. And later, Jim White, his father, will get really upset when the press or the police kind of insinuate that there might not have been someone there. So even though they think some of this, I think it's just the place it happened to Ukiah. It's a pretty busy street. There's schools, there's churches, there's medical offices. The idea that this happened and he ran and he screamed and no one saw anything is just hard to believe, but they do defend their son.
But at the same time, the adventure word, I mean, is there any quote that Timothy said it was like an adventure?
No, his parents.
So this could have been that he just kind of being a 5-year-old, how he talked about watering his plants and stuff like that. It just changed. So they're like, oh, it seemed like an adventure for him. So they might not actually know what he was feeling.
And he might really be talking about the time he spends with Stephen as opposed to being gone.
The actual
and
kidnapping.
not the time. Yeah, the actual kidnapping. And I mean, there's always a second option here, which is that someone did witness it and just never came forward.
And that's not that far off because you have the guy who actually saved them on the dirt road. He never came forward.
Right. And he's a hero.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, police do set out to find who might have been this second kidnapper. After spending time in a holding cell, Stephen talks with police. The police are able to find corroborating evidence of Stephen's story, and they begin to try and piece together all the things that happened to him during the 7 years. And luckily for the police, Stephen has a really good memory and is able to give them a lot of detail. But this takes some time to get through to him, because according to Jerry Stayner, Stephen's uncle, the police also have to convince Stephen that his parents loved and missed him. So this is just more of the duality of what he's feeling. He's still going through a lot, and there's a lot to process, so this is not surprising. One of the officers also takes Stephen to Denny's to get a meal, and it's just been a long night for for Stephen and the White family. At some point, they tell Stephen that he's going to be taken home to Merced, and Stephen's response to this is to ask if he can go back to the cabin and get his dog Queenie to take with him. And this just struck me because here's this child who's been through so much, he's processing a lot, he's also going to go home and see a family he hasn't seen for 7 years and might not remember that much of, and his first thought is that he needs to get to his dog to take home with him. I just found that amazing. And the fact that he has to go back to the cabin, which has to bring up a lot of feelings and stuff to get it. And I believe he also asks the police to take care of the other animals
that are there that you can't take home.
Right.
Yeah, it's almost like the dog is I don't want to say a security blanket, but it's a piece that has kept him grounded through all of this terribleness with Parnell. That this could be like a piece of what he considers home.
At 2 p.m. in Ukiah, a press conference is held by police in which both Stephen and the White family are there to answer questions. This press conference is held at the Ukiah City Council chambers, and I cannot emphasize this enough, but this is approximately 14 hours from the time Stephen, a boy who's been missing for 7 years, a boy who police know very little about, and a case they've just begun to piece together, and this 14-year-old is put before cameras to answer questions. And he hasn't talked even with his parents at all, not even on the phone. And I'm not sure whose job it is in cases like this to advocate for the child or make decisions, but reading about this day, it just sort of doesn't feel like anybody is really thinking about that or making those decisions for him.
I had no clue that he wouldn't have just called his parents already. They wouldn't let him call. That's really odd.
Do you suppose that might have something to do with the idea? I mean, I know by this point they're pretty sure that he isn't involved in the crime, but a little lingering suspicion that...
But if you're going to put him in front of a whole press conference, I think you should be able to call your parents at 14 before you're put in front of like a vulture pit of people asking you questions.
And I don't know that they wouldn't let him call. I just know that he doesn't.
Well,
I don't know if it just doesn't occur to anybody or if they're just waiting, it's better for him to see them for the first time in person. I don't know, but I just know he doesn't talk to them
He's still under the assumption, though,
Oh, they don't like him.
that his parents gave him away.
Right. He's still going through all of that.
So, I mean, and we're still talking about, around 14 hours from going to a life with Parnell and abuse and torture to, hey, you're going to go see your real parents, but there's got to be a part of him that still maybe cling to that lie that says they gave him away.
But besides all that, I just don't know who the geniuses were between the police and the reporters to put him in front of a stage before he's even been home.
And we've talked about it a lot, though, but it's still a time when people aren't.
It's common sense right there, I feel like.
I think it is now, and I would hope that it is then, but I don't think at the time in 1980 that people had I don't think we had the victims' rights advocates that we do now. I don't think most people would even equate. All they're seeing is it's the same thing as we're seeing with the parents. All they're seeing is the positive things. They're not really diving into like all of the harm that could potentially be, that what's not only done to this child, or both of them really, but Stephen in particular, but then all of the lasting harm that can be done from what he's having to now suffer through.
And this whole situation is really maddening, but I think it's really important to understand we've covered a lot in our episodes, things that happened that we just couldn't believe happened and didn't get changed until people did the wrong thing over and over. And this is a situation, this is before CNN hasn't even gone on the air, yet this kind of media landscape that we're used to didn't exist. So I'm not sure people in Ukiah or even Merced are quite ready to deal with this on that big of a level. The other thing that really I wondered about was who's actually legally in charge of Stephen in this moment, because he's been with someone who's his kidnapper, but that person he thought of as a father. So obviously Parnell's not legally able to make decisions for him, but he hasn't been put back in the custody of his family yet. So I don't know who's supposed to be making those decisions. But even if there was somebody, there are actually no laws about talking to children and the press.
Even today?
Today.
So that means if I'm a newspaper reporter or a television reporter or internet reporter, I can talk to a child at any time without their parents' permission.
Yes. And in fact, in California, so it's sort of up to each state, but most states don't have laws about this. It's covered under contract law, so you can sue afterwards and say they defamed you or something like that. There are ethics that good reporters are supposed to follow.
You mean like libel laws? Like I have,
yeah.
But wouldn't I have to prove that they said something terrible or hurt?
There's a whole bunch of different laws for that, so it would change depending on the situation. But yeah, apparently even in California, so what we're used to is people having to sign in when they go into schools and stuff. Apparently that's just something they tell you. Under the law, a reporter can walk into a school without signing in and talk to kids. There's no rules specifically outlawing it. And kids under the Constitution have First Amendment rights. So that's sort of the thing that protects them. But just thinking about this case and everything that happens to Stephen, and then I went through all of it, and the place I just lost it was these press conferences. And this is just the first of a couple, because it's just happened, and it makes me so angry. And I really hope, I think things have changed. It's not often we see someone who's been taken immediately go into a press conference. And like I said, even though this is not that long ago, I don't think anyone's really equipped to deal with this massive influx of reporters or what that means. And as time goes on, police stations will get media people in, and there are victims groups that will help. So we learn from it, but I really hope no one ever has to experience this.
It's an interesting idea too, because we live in a time where we have citizen journalists, people with cell phones that have now become instant on-the-spot reporting of every terrible thing that happens. Within 5 minutes, it's up on YouTube or it's up on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. So that lends a different take to it too.
Right. And there are some things where that would be good. There are positives and negatives,
right,
I think, depending on the situation. So I understand it makes it difficult to build laws about that. But I don't think there are very many parents who would appreciate having their child thrust onto the stage like that after being kidnapped or after something else terrible happened, something traumatic. It's its own trauma to me.
Right. You're victimizing the person all over again in the name of a good story.
I don't know if it's really all over again. It's a brand new experience of victimizing.
Right. It's a continuation of. At
the press conference, Timothy sits at least for part of it with Stephen holding a balloon. Stephen is asked many questions. The most common quote attributed to him comes from this press conference when asked why he brought Timothy into the police. His answer was, quote, "I brought him to me because I didn't like what was happening. It happened to me and I didn't want to see it happen to anyone else." And you can find that quote in any newspaper. The press is also very interested in what Stephen's plans were after he had brought Timothy in. And I want to talk for a second about just the enormous pressure. We've gone over that a lot, but on Stephen, and you can just see a glimpse, I think, of it in his answer to this question. And it's a question he'll get asked a lot for the next couple of days. This is a young man he's just going through so much, and he's feeling guilty. And I doubt he feels he can be honest about that. He knows he's going home, and he'll actually later be asked the same question in Merced and have a different answer. And he doesn't want to hurt or offend anyone, so he answers, "I really don't know," a lot of the time. Stephen is also asked questions about Parnell and his life with him, but Merced detectives have instructed him not to answer those questions. They're building a case, and they don't want it compromised, and they seem a little more protective of the information than the Ukiah police do. I think they're just experiencing it from different perspectives. They have to build a case that goes back much farther than the Ukiah police.
Or this could just be that they're a little more seasoned since they're a bigger city.
Yeah, I mean, nobody said this in anything I read, but you kind of read between the lines. For me, it seemed like Merced detectives were a lot more, I don't know, in on maybe what happened or suspected things earlier.
Well, this is a case they've been working on off and on for 7 years. So, like you said, they're trying to build a case going back 7 years, but it is a bigger place. They probably have a larger police force, and for the Ukiah side, their main focus was Timothy. So this Stephen's like, oh wow, like,
yeah,
this is a bonus.
To Ukiah, the Stephen case is what 11 hours, old,
right.
because Merced's been had 7 years, so they know.
And this is before there's a lot of public information, or any really public information, I should say, about Parnell and his past. So the press doesn't know that quite yet, and I think police are still figuring some of that stuff out. Stephen does still get asked many specific questions, even though they've told the press we're not going to answer them. The police allow him to tell the press some of the cities he and Parnell lived in. They let him say that he lived in Yosemite, Santa Rosa, Combs, Manchester, and Willits, but they wouldn't let him share all the cities.
Do you think that's because they were trying to find possible other crimes that he had committed in those same cities?
It's possible, because I don't know. I couldn't find anything that came of this or why those specific cities. I do know later that police will find that there were people who made accusations against Parnell in other cities, but they never filed any charges or anything like that. So this is still 14 hours. I'm not sure they would have that information yet, or why, if they suspected that, they wouldn't also suspect that in these cities that they do mention.
Right.
So I don't know. Stephen is also asked how he feels about Parnell. During the Ukiah press conference, the idea of giving Stephen Stayner the $15,000 reward for the return of Timothy White is floated by the White family and by police. The $15,000, if you remember, was a reward that the city and lots of people donated towards to help find Timothy. And it isn't as if there's money sitting around just waiting to be handed out. There's a committee, and they still have to collect it all. So this is just the first you'll hear of people believing Stephen deserves to get that money. And eventually, even Timothy's babysitter will write a letter to the editor in support of the idea. So the whole town is really excited, and he's a hero to them. The press is also very interested in Parnell as well. As I said, Merced detectives are keeping Stephen from answering specific questions about Parnell, but the press continue to ask. The police and Mendocino County District Attorney Joe Allen answer questions as well. The motive Allen offers the press in this first conference for the kidnappings is, quote, "It seems he wanted to build a family for himself without going through the trouble of getting married." Angie White will also echo this when she talks to the press and says that Parnell, quote, "had no malicious intent. He just wanted a little boy." So I think this is just, they still don't quite understand what's going on in this case.
It's just the idea that child abuse is not the first thing that you would go to. I think if that story were to happen today, the first thing that you would think, I think everybody would think, was that child was abused.
After the press conference in Ukiah, the Merced detectives begin the journey to Merced to take Stephen and his dog Queenie home. This doesn't stop the press in Ukiah. Both the Ukiah newspaper and the Merced newspaper are fielding calls from all across the world, from people wanting to know if it's true that Stephen has been found. They're also getting calls from newspapers, magazines, and tabloids from around the world. The editor of the Ukiah Daily Journal, Jim Garner, will write about calls he's getting from places as far away as Germany. A magazine in Germany, for instance, called asking him to over the phone read every article that they have written on the topic.
The German German newspaper wants the Ukiah paper to read the Ukiah paper's articles.
Yeah, so they can either, I don't know if they're trying to print them in whole.
Oh, so it's like,
or if they're just
reprint.
going to rewrite their own articles based on that
Right.
information, but they want the information. He tells them no, because by this time, by a couple days in, they'll have a lot of articles.
Right.
The National Enquirer will call and offer him money for all the photos they've taken. They give them that line that you hear in movies, price is no object. The tabloid World Star calls from Florida asking for information on the, quote, homosexual aspect of the story. And Garner says that he can't print what he told the person who asked him this, so he's very upset that someone would call and ask this kind of thing. And this sort of, it reminded me of stuff we talked about in episode 1 and last episode, things that are going on in the 1980s, people's still connection between people who are gay and people who are hurting kids. And it's just frustrating that these people would call and they want to print that in their tabloid. And it sounds like Jim Garner, who's the editor, as I said, he tells most of these folks off. And the Ukiah Daily Journal writes that any money he receives for stories or pictures will go directly to Timothy White and his family. So this person, despite we're talking about the press not being very great, this person seems like...
Yeah, he seems pretty good.
Yeah. Garner is also pretty amazed at the intense focus of the press on this story. And he thinks that this is partially because it's finally a good news story. So many people. And going through the 80s... newspapers, there's just a lot of really terrible stories, both locally and internationally, and I think that kind of makes sense.
Well, I know we've all talked about it before when we were doing research for various cases this season and looking ahead. Anytime you go near the 70s, it's something terrible. I mean, it's the papers and news footage is just covered with horrible stories of crime and world events, and so I can see a lot of people getting excited for this too, because it is a really positive something that happened.
People are being hounded in all the places they can find someone to interview by the press, and people are surprised and angry. Radio shows are covering this crime, and people are calling in and threatening Parnell's life, for instance, and this would go on for days. And it's a good reminder that even in Ukiah, just like Immer said, this isn't something that just happened to Timothy White or to his family. It's something that happened to the place, something that happened to Ukiah. Somebody came in and stole one of their kids, and it affected how they live their daily lives. They no longer let their kids play outside or drove them to school. And so the fact that it's someone basically in their community.
Somebody who worked there, who had a life, who had acquaintances or even friends.
Right. So it hurts them as well. And people are being interviewed, as I said, throughout Ukiah. For instance, Parnell's boss at the Palace Hotel, and he gives the paper one of the greatest quotes I've ever seen. In the Merced Sun-Star, he would say, quote, "Everyone's feeling around here at the hotel was if you made a list of suspects at the hotel, he would have been close to the bottom of the list. He was unemotional, quiet, level-headed, good, steady employee." And I thought, when I read this quote, I thought, what kind of people work at the Palace Hotel?
If he's at the bottom of the list.
Right?
Who's the guy at the top of the list?
Right? You should give that list to police. That night in Ukiah, the White family also has a celebration, so it's not just in Merced. This one's a little bit smaller with their friends and neighbors, and they have a barbecue. They're also very happy. And hours away from Ukiah in Merced, at about 7 p.m., Merced detectives would pull up at the Stayner house with their son, Stephen Stayner. You've probably all seen these photos of the Stayners embracing their child. Those photos are actually the first time they see Stephen, and it happens in front of the police, right in front of their house, and in front of everybody who's there. And they're very excited and they're very happy. But this child who's been gone for 7 years is reunited with his family, basically in front of the entire world.
It's like the Truman Show.
Yeah. And when he does emerge, the place erupts into cheers. And as he hugs his family, Stephen says, "It's good to be home." The press captures all of it and immediately start asking questions. So sort of it's not planned, but there's just a press conference almost on their front lawn. And it's unfortunately a lot of the same questions we've already heard. This first night, the Stayner family will stay up most of the night together in an effort to get to know one another. Sitting together, they show Stephen photo albums of the family throughout the years. They mostly just stay up and look at each other. Delbert is quoted in the Merced Sun-Star as saying, quote, "We weren't talking too much. We're just kind of looking at each other." And the family knows they can't expect Stephen is the same child that was kidnapped 7 years ago. But knowing this and living it is very difficult. When he's found, Kay Stayner will say, quote, "Well, we've just got to remember Stevie is not a little, cuddly 7-year-old anymore that you could slap on the fanny and tell to go out and play. He's a man now, almost. We're just going to have to remember all of this." And I don't know what this is like to have your son back. You've missed him for 7 years, desperately. You love him, but these are people who also don't really know each other. 7 years is a long time. They've both been through a lot. Steven's grown up.
Well, for the Stainers, in some ways, their family stopped. I mean, they have 7 years. Their family was put on pause. And so coming to terms with the fact that the little kid that was kidnapped is now a 14-year-old, semi-adult, and then coming to terms with what's been done to him, with which they still don't know. And then for Steven, having to wrap his mind around all the lies that he's been told and the abuse
With Kay's comment, it's almost like the scenario of when a child gets addicted to drugs and it's like, I don't know my little child anymore kind of situation. So it's all new and they don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah, it's this person you have a really close connection with. They're your child. But because you weren't there when they really started to read or got into certain TV shows or whatever it is they like, you missed all that and you don't know them. And then you're also confronted with the fact that you don't know them. It's just such a big thing to go through.
And no one can help you through that. It's not like you can go to somebody for help because no one's been in this situation.
Especially at this time.
Right.
The next morning, Monday, March 3rd, 1980, the Stayner family, along with police, hold a press conference in their front yard. This is the third time in 2 days after Steven has been found that he will stand before reporters and answer questions. Again, Merced police try to keep Steven from answering specific questions. Like the press conference on Sunday, Steven is asked repeatedly what his plans for the future are and what his plans were when he took Timothy to the police station. And these seem, again, like really unfair questions to ask any 14-year-old, really, much less one who's been kidnapped for 7 years. His answer does change a little from the first time he was asked in Ukiah, where he responded he didn't know. Now he's saying, quote, "I probably would have come back home on my own." And I think this is a lot just to ask him also in front of a family he's just getting to know, and he doesn't want to let them down or other people down.
It's got to be hard for him because he's coming to terms with the reality that his family has been looking for him and still loves him, with knowing that all the lies that Kenneth Parnell has told him that his family gave him away, they didn't want him. That's going to be a hard thing for him to deal with.
And he'll talk about this time in his life when he's spending more time with his family and his siblings, and he's looking at photo albums, and he gets for the first time to see all the things that he missed. And that really affects him much differently than, like you're talking about before, where he thought that's what they wanted. And now he realizes Parnell kept him, not just from seeing his family, but experiencing what it would have been like to have siblings or take trips with their family.
Right, because it's not just the abuse is terrible and unconscionable, but also is the robbing Stephen and his family of all of 7 years worth of birthdays and holidays and Christmases and good times and bad, him becoming a part of the family.
And we'll talk about this more when we talk about the trial portion of this. But when you really think about it like that, kidnapping doesn't really ever cover the kind of crime that this is. It's almost like stealing from Stephen and stealing from his family. All of these things that could have been.
But you're stealing something that you can't put a monetary price on. You can't get reparations for. I mean, if I steal a loaf of bread that has a value that's agreed upon, how do you put a value on 7 years worth of birthdays?
They don't really, and we'll talk about that more when Parnell gets a very low sentence. And also, there just doesn't seem to be a law or statute that really covers what this really is. They also asked Stephen if he recognized his family, and he says he would have recognized his parents, but obviously it's been 7 years since he's seen his siblings, and they've aged as well. The press are also asking specific questions about sexual abuse. On this Monday, the press will have more information on Parnell's past and his felony charge in Bakersfield, so they're actually starting to become really interested in this aspect of Stephen's life and what he may have been through.
Some of the articles, did you read that by this time are some of those becoming public knowledge? They're being published in the newspaper, or is that coming yet?
Yeah, no, this starts on this first Monday. You'll have some articles about his past, about the crime that he committed, and then the press will really go full force in just covering Parnell's life. And they get information from, they get information from the warden at San Quentin. That's how they get like his psychological profile.
So, and this is because I can't imagine then that the Stayner family is taking time to read Monday morning's newspaper or probably even watch the news. So the general public probably is getting a better sense of who Kenneth Parnell was than the parents of the person that kidnapped Stephen.
I do think they probably are paying close attention, and unfortunately, they learn a lot of that in the newspaper like everybody else.
So okay.
And for instance, on this Monday, it's about this time that the police in Merced will tell the public that they're looking for a third person, who we know is Irvin Murphy. The Stayner family had no idea that there was another person involved in the kidnapping, and they hear that at this press conference. So they learn it as we learn it.
So I just want to get this straight. The reporters are asking Stephen about sexual abuse on his front lawn before he's even really got to talk to his parents. His parents don't really know about sexual abuse yet. And the reporters are saying this?
Well, the police are there as well, so it's a big press conference. And they are asking, I don't know if they specifically asked Stephen, but they're asking the police if this is something they're interested in. Because now, on the 3rd, they know Parnell has hurt another child.
Right.
So it occurs to them that might be what's happening here. And it's important to remember that Stephen hasn't even really talked to the police about the abuse that he suffered. So at this time, they're still under the impression that it hasn't happened or he hasn't told them. In Ukiah, they're saying that the motive for these crimes is that Parnell wanted to build a family. So no one really knows yet, but the Merced police seem to me, in their answers to these questions, a little more protective of information.
Okay, so when it was asked, the police would tell the reporters no, or just not say, we're not going to talk about that.
And they wouldn't allow Stephen they would intercede. They wouldn't allow Stephen to answer specific questions about his time, mainly with Parnell.
Yeah, but I think I just want to make sure that it's out there that no matter who they were asking, Stephen's standing there with his parents that he has hardly talked to except hugged, and they decide to ask if he's been sexually abused.
Right.
Okay.
I can't imagine as a parent hearing that for the first time.
I just can't believe that the reporters would let themselves have that come out of their mouths.
Well, and I've never given much thought to all of the victims groups. I mean, I've never had someone go missing in my life, so I've never had to deal with that. But this really makes you appreciate those groups and the work that they do to protect families and victims and to explain to them what will be happening next and how to keep the press at bay and all of that. That's when I saw this, I really hoped this still doesn't happen. And obviously it still can if you don't take advantage of those groups that will help you. But it's so thankful that those exist.
Because I can imagine that's a very thin wire to walk. I don't want the intrusion of those people into my lives, but I need what they can offer to get the word out and to, in the beginning to make sure that the story of like my missing loved one is constantly in the media.
Right.
And then once they're found, it's almost like I don't want to say a payoff, but like the reciprocation of yes, because of that.
I helped you. Now it's my turn to be whoever I want to be.
Right. You would hope that they would have integrity enough to say.
Well, and I have mixed feelings on the importance of the press. And there are really good reasons, and we'll talk about this more next episode when they have issues covering the trial. But for the press to have information and to share it with people, I think doing it in front of the victim or the victim's family is just a bad idea. And I do think based on what we've seen, that's been rectified in 2019, hopefully. But I do think there are probably good reasons the press should tell people what Kenneth Parnell actually did.
Right.
Part of it is he doesn't have a long sentence and he is going to get out. And I don't know, I think people might feel better knowing who this person was, especially if he's going to live in their community. But at the same time, maybe there is no good reason to know the specifics or what he did to somebody else.
It's that tightrope again, though.
But I think, if anything, we know that this was wrong time, wrong place.
Right.
Yeah. Those kind of questions didn't need to be brought up.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why they chose to do another press conference. I don't know if it's because all of these people are camped out on their lawn. They're in Merced. Maybe they thought if they did this, they would ask their questions and then move on. Maybe they needed to update everybody. I'm not really sure, but I am, like I said, thankful that.
Well, you've said a few times in the course of the episodes so far, and I know we'll talk about it more in upcoming episodes. But we are, as you stated, at the start of this 24-hour news cycle. It's
right.
Still, I think nowadays with Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and things where we get up to the second updates on stories, our attention spans have gotten a lot shorter. And this is kind of a start of that. I mean, he was just found 3 days ago. And I think maybe people's voracious appetite for that is starting to ramp up. So where they're almost feeding that fire a little bit for more and more of that story.
Well, and normally you would be calling a press conference in a small town like this for just the paper of that town or maybe a couple of papers. And then suddenly there's all these people they have to deal with, and they're still learning on how to do that. And we can't forget in Merced, there's also more of a celebratory atmosphere. You know, they don't know this is all good news for them. They don't know what's happened to Stephen during those 7 years. He hasn't told them the truth. And for this family, they're just excited and want to share that with the world. Stephen is also asked if he expects to see Parnell, and Stephen says, quote, "I don't know. I kind of feel sorry for him." The family are also asked questions, and it's in this press conference that I saw something that I saw a lot of people talking about, but they're asked if they're going to get Stephen some help. And Kay Stayner responds in a quote that I saw in many, many newspapers, "We're going to try to make it on our own." And this is something that I saw kind of over and over the Stayner family being judged for. I think especially if you're looking at it from a 2019 perspective, getting help is not as stigmatized as it was in the 80s and even before that and after that. I mean, I still think there's a stigma attached to it, which is unfortunate. But what's odd is that about 8 days later in the Ukiah Daily Journal, they actually do a piece where the end of it is kind of a recap of the things that have happened. And they quote Kay Stayner on that day after she was asked that question, but the quote is longer. So it's not the quote that you normally see in newspapers. She actually says this when asked if she'll get help for Stephen. Quote, "We're going to try to make it on our own, but if we find we need help, we won't hesitate to seek it," which is a completely different answer than the one I've seen people use to really sort of judge this family, which even if they had said that first answer, makes sense for the time period to me. There's a whole lot going on. About a month before Stephen's found, there's a huge article about forced sterilizations in mental hospitals. I mean, there's all kinds of stereotypes and stigmas attached to getting help. So it didn't surprise me. I was all set to defend that, and we shouldn't judge them, and we shouldn't judge other people. But then I read that this is an even longer quote.
Well, it's difference between the first one being taken as a woman who's just going to do it, no, we know best, we'll handle it. Almost the arrogance that they can do better than a professional. The actual quote, though, is a woman who just wants her family back intact and will do whatever she needs to make sure that he's okay. They're going to try, but they'll get help if and when they need it.
It almost seemed like kind of like original clickbait because this kind of reminds me of, it was not that long ago, and David Lynch said that Trump could go down as the greatest president ever, but it was just how the article was written. And you had like on Twitter, everyone just railing on David Lynch for saying that. But if they would have read the article, it's not anything what he meant. So did they use the little dots everywhere so they could say that there's more of a quote in the other papers that you saw?
No. And I mean, I think that's because they just quoted her first sentence. They didn't have to.
Right. Oh, okay.
And I'm not even sure that there was anything amiss in doing that. I assume, it's the 1980s. People aren't running to get help, to a psychologist or...
Well, like you said, especially with the time period and a lot of stuff coming out about people getting mental help still being stigmatized, but also some of those institutions where you would go to get mental help and all of the horror stories that are coming out of that. I don't think I would want to send my loved one to one of those institutions, talk to some of those professionals.
Right. And they're still figuring out, they've just gotten their son back and they don't have the information, as we said. So, it's probably an unfair question to ask in general, what's your plan to help him?
Yeah.
Let me ask you, on the day that your entire life turned upside down,
right,
exactly what your plans are for the next 4 years.
Yeah, so these all seem like 4-year later interviews almost. Like the questions that they're asking, it's not first
what
day.
What did you do to help Stephen get over this? Or, now that you've had time to reconnect with your family.
Yeah, for 2 hours here.
Right.
Let's ask these questions.
What are your plans, Stephen, for the rest of your life? What 14-year-old boy or girl or anyone really would be able to answer what's your plans for the future as a 14-year-old?
Not too many.
Not too many.
No. He did get a handful of counseling sessions, and he was also counseled by his minister. So it's just another instance of it's important to remember that people aren't you and they'll get help if they need it, or might find different help that works for them, or maybe help might not be helpful. Every person deserves to be more than the sum of the worst thing to ever happen to them. This would never be an option for Stephen Stayner. Even now in the Central Valley, you have people tell stories about the things they did in relation to Stephen Stayner. They might have gone to school with him or known a friend of his. And in many ways, this is understandable. On these first days, we can see how excited the town is. They all participated in helping find him. But Kenneth Parnell wasn't the only person to hurt Stephen. And this first day with the press conference and others, it's only the beginning of interest in his life and story that will last well until after his own life would end. The least we can do is use his experience to guide us in our discussions and treatment of others who experience kidnapping or abuse, to make sure we see the person behind the event or our own complicity in keeping abuse victims from coming forward will continue. The end of this Monday in Merced would mark the beginning of the Stayner family learning to live together again. The children stay out of school for about a week to spend time getting to know Stephen, and he them, but this would be a difficult road. The media would be there when he did anything, when he was found, when he goes to school for the first time again, when he goes to trial, and there are 2 trials, so they're there a lot, when he went to every hearing, got in trouble, ever made any mistake, just for everything in his life. We'll end here tonight, and we'll just end with kind of some good news, already making some changes. Just this year, we saw a high-profile kidnapping when Jamie Kloss was kidnapped in Wisconsin and escaped. And after her escape, Elizabeth Smart, who's a writer and advocate and a kidnapped victim herself, just went to Kloss's hometown to meet with the people and advise them on how to act. She spoke with 1,300 residents to tell them how to best support Kloss. She suggested things like smile, but not to stare if they see her somewhere. And instead of contacting her directly, she said to write a letter so that she can choose when to read them and deal with that when she's ready. And I really hope that this is how we can continue to treat victims and people who are kidnapped, and I really wish this had happened in Stephen's case. Next episode, we will talk about the steps police in Merced and Ukiah take to gather all the facts in the kidnapping case, and also their search for Parnell's accomplices. We'll also cover the continuing focus on Stephen and his story, and Barbara Mathias will make an unfortunate appearance.
The details for our cold case this episode come from the Merced Sun-Star and ABC30.com. On Wednesday, November 21st, 2012, a property manager for an orchard near Atwater, California, in Merced County found the body of 21-year-old Brian Sanchez, also of Atwater, California, near a burn pile. The orchard was located near South Highway 59 and Dickerson Ferry Road. Sanchez was a missing person who had last been seen at his mother's house in Atwater on November 16th, 2012, and also seen that same day at an apartment complex on Broadway and First Street. Police believe he had been in the orchard for 5 days. He was identified with DNA, and an autopsy lists his death as gunshot wounds. The Merced Sheriff's Department considers Sanchez's death a homicide. Despite working through Thanksgiving of 2012 and continuing to follow up on leads, the Merced County Sheriffs have not given a motive for the crime. Brian Sanchez was 21 years old at the time of this murder. He was the youngest of 6 siblings and lived with his sister and her family in Merced, California. Sanchez's family believes he may have been taken advantage of by someone preying on his developmental disabilities. According to his family, he had the mental capacity of a teenager and had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and social anxiety that kept him from having contact with many people. His family continues to search for justice in this case and for any information which might lead to a conviction about his murder. They miss him very much. Sanchez was an avid runner and had dreams to becoming a pro football player. If you have any information on the murder of Brian Sanchez, please contact the Merced County Sheriff's Department at 209-385-7472.
Thank you for listening to this episode of California True Crime. You can contact us on our Facebook page or by email, calitruecrime@gmail.com, or on Twitter and Instagram @calitruecrime. We also would like to thank our quality control officer, Melanie Boot Barn Duncan. This episode was recorded at Chateau Walnut.